everyone, and welcome. We are excited that so many of you could join us for our conversation on how to start making real change with those you'd rather cancel. I'm Pele Shalev, the Public Events Specialist for the Public Programs Department of the California Institute of Integral Studies, nonprofit university in San Francisco. We may be joining from different places all over the world, and as a representative of CIIS, I want to start off by expressing our debt and gratitude to the Ramai Tu Shaloni, the original peoples and continual caretakers of the San Francisco Peninsula. CIIS campus is located on the traditional unceded lands of the Ramai Tu Shaloni, which they call Yalamu. In the Ramai Tu Shaloni language, Yalamu identifies both the people and the territory. This acknowledgement is only a single small step towards being in deeper connection and relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our community, and does not begin to acknowledge all the native lands, languages, and territories where you are right now, or where you live and work every day. I invite you to take a moment now to acknowledge the land where you reside, and to commit to learn more about the native communities near you, and to support their work. If it feels right for you to share in the chat, please do. We always recommend native-land.ca as a starting resource. Before we start, I want to go over a few general tips and troubleshooting items. We will have a Q&A after the conversation tonight. Please submit your questions at any time using our anonymous web form, which is linked in the event description below this video. We'll be pulling questions from that form, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We do have automatically generated captions for this event, which you can toggle on and off using the closed captioning button in YouTube. Chat will be enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated, and our presenters cannot see the chat. Chat is not required to fully experience the event. If you choose to participate in chat, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. You can turn the chat off at any time, and we encourage you to do so if you find it negatively impacting your experience in any way. If you're having issues with your audio or video, we always suggest that you start by refreshing the page. And then if you still have issues, we suggest that you adjust your video settings within YouTube. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Loretta J. Ross and Dr. Alka Arora, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Dr. Alka Arora is a professor in the Women's Spirituality program at CIIS. Her research and teaching are centered on spiritual activism, ecofeminism, and integral feminist education. In addition, Dr. Arora is a workshop leader, leadership coach, and education consultant, supporting individuals and communities in their efforts to create meaningful transformation. Currently, she is particularly interested in issues of political polarization and groupthink within activist communities. Loretta J. Ross is an activist, professor, and public intellectual. In her 5 decades in the human rights movement, she's deprogrammed white supremacists, taught convicted rapists the principles of feminism, and organized the second largest march in Washington, the March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C. on April 25, 2004, surpassed in size only by the 2017 Women's March. A co-founder of the National Center for Human Rights Education and the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, her many accolades and honors include a 2022 MacArthur Fellowship and a 2024 induction into the National Women's Hall of Fame. Today, Ross is an associate professor at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, and is the founder of La Rosta Consulting, with which she runs calling in training sessions online and for organizations around the country. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Alka Arora and Loretta J. Ross.
Thank you so much, Pele, and welcome, Loretta. It is such a pleasure to meet you. I have to say, when I saw the description of your book and the title, Calling In, How to Make Change, How to Start Making Change with Those You'd Rather Cancel, something in me just like lit up. It's like I got goosebumps. I was like, this is the kind of conversation I want to be having right now, given all that I'm dealing with as an educator and just what I see in the social landscape. So I'm very honored to have this opportunity to speak with you today.
Well, thanks for having me.
And thank you for saying, being up quite late. I know it's much later on the East Coast than it is over at CIIS, so it's much appreciated. So Loretta, your book weaves together your personal activist experience with a broader cultural analysis to explore the dynamics of call-outs and call-ins. Can you say a little bit about what motivated and inspired you to write this book?
This is probably an accidental book. I've written 3 books or co-written 3 books on reproductive justice because that's what I'm most known for, having co-created that theory in 1994. But about a decade ago, my grandson used to let all of my calls go to voicemail. And that didn't sit well with me. So I finally got hold of him and said, listen, you're my only heir. And if you don't put a ring on that phone for grandma, you might find yourself disappointed. But he said, well, grandma, get on Facebook. I got on Facebook. He migrated off to Tactic or whatever the kids migrate to. But
TikTok.
right, right. But once I stayed on Facebook, because he did say it was old for old folks, and he was right, I noticed how unbelievably mean people were to each other. And I didn't quite understand it because I knew people were saying things online that they probably didn't have the courage to say to a person's face. And so when I asked other young people what was going on, they named it the call out culture. But when I asked what they were doing about it, they kind of shrugged and said, oh, well, it's as inevitable as, gravity or something. And that answer didn't sit well with me because I started processing my life and how I had a lot of unlikely conversations with improbable people. I said, organizing is basically making change with people you don't necessarily like, but you need in order to build a power base in order to change those human rights violations. And so I started first by organizing a group of students at Smith College, asked them how the call out cancel culture affected them. To a person, 100 students said that they were afraid to just speak their minds, that they were afraid to tweet something that might come back to haunt them, that they were walking around on verbal eggshells for fear of being canceled or called out. And so I began my research, started writing a book in 2015. In my research, I found that I was not original, that an 18-year-old trans man named Lone Trad had actually invented the concept of calling in. And when I finally got hold of Lone and talked to him, they said that they were afraid of the pushback that they had already received. And so they had dropped the concept, didn't want to do any more writing on it or work on it. But still, I didn't let that deter me. So I started doing more research. And after a period of time, I finally produced the book, and Simon and Schuster picked it up. And now we have techniques. The other thing I want to say is that I read a lot of books criticizing and analyzing the cancel culture, but none of the books said what to do about it. And so I wanted to make sure my book devoted an equal amount of time to teaching techniques, that there are ways we can actually learn to call people in instead of just assuming that our only option is to call people out.
Mm. Thank you. I think that's one of the things I most appreciated was that you do provide those very specific strategies. And I have to say, I must be getting old too, because I'm still on Facebook. I'm not out there as much as I used to be. And I've had the experience, I think a few years ago, of having just a minor disagreement with another progressive on something over Facebook and getting sort of like uh, just like slammed for it. And I thought, I don't want to do this anymore. This is not a good use of my time and energy. And it has felt to me that, something has kind of escalated in the last 5 to 10 years around this sort of infighting. And I know you've been an activist for a long time, Loretta, and you do note in your book that it's not new, right? Like infighting among progressives, some form of calling out and counseling has always existed. But it does seem to be that there's more walking on eggshells in the last few years. Would you agree that that's the case? And what do you think? If so, what do you think is causing that shift?
Well, it's one thing when one person can say something bad about you. You might feel a way about that. You might feel a little shame. But it's another thing with when they can get 10,000 people within a few hours to say that same bad thing about you. That
Mm,
virality of social media means that people's lives are forever changed when they've been publicly called out and shamed, because there's a before the call out life and then the after the call out life. And you spend the rest of your time wondering, is that person looking at me this way because they saw what happened on the internet about me? And
mm,
so I think that our toys have gotten faster and probably more deadly, but our human emotions are basically the same. I mean, the original definition of a call out was an invitation to a duel. That's
mm.
what killed Alexander Hamilton.
I did
And
not
so,
know that.
yeah, that was the original definition. When you call somebody out, you are
Mm.
inviting them to a duel at dawn and you're going to shoot them or hope to shoot them. And so we've always had beefs with each other, and we've always used the power of shaming and blaming
Mm.
to try to hold people accountable. But nowadays, those tools are so inadequate, and I hope nobody calls me out at dawn and tries to shoot me because I can't shoot. But still, we still need accountability measures. But do they have to be so mean? And do they
Mm,
have to be so deadly? One of
mm,
the things I say in my book is that you can say what you mean and you can mean what you say, but you don't have to say it mean. That's always a
mm,
choice. How
mhm,
you choose to pursue accountability is a testament to your values and your integrity versus your desire to hold somebody accountable.
Beautifully said. I also really love that you say in your book, kindness is political. But what I wanted to really appreciate is that you are so authentic and honest about your own experiences in your text. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so relatable and such a joy to read. And early on in your book, you refer to yourself as a reformed call out queen. So can you say more about younger Loretta, who was the call out queen, and what was driving you at those times?
It's not even the younger Loretta. I have a fiery temper and I don't have a real good filter on my
Mm,
tongue. So I still get the impulse to call people out when I've encountered meanness or unkindness or when people have just gotten on my nerves because I
mm,
don't like a whole lot of people who go around triggering people into arguments and discomfort and stuff like that. And but I learned that when I indulged in the calling people out, it didn't quite achieve what I wanted it to achieve.
mm,
I was instead blowing up relationships, presenting the worst part of myself. Because one of the things that I talk about is the difference between being trauma driven and trauma informed.
mm.
When I was driven by my trauma, I would let loose with my tongue and I could slice and dice anybody up and didn't care about it because I felt that they deserved it. And I'm really good at playing what we used to call the dozens because I grew up with five brothers and we used to talk about each other's mama and we all had the same mama. So, so that's my default. But I've learned over the years that I wanted to be more strategic. I wanted to be more effective. And I had to put my ego and my trauma on pause in order to create the change that I wanted to see and present the Loretta that I could look in the mirror without shame. So I wouldn't be ashamed of what I've done. And the fact that I inappropriately use my innate power to humiliate and shame others simply because they weren't doing what I wanted them to do.
Mm. That's that's a profound reflection. And I can say there is a lot of what you said that I can relate to. I mean, I don't know what sign you are, but I'm an Aries. So
I'm a
there's
Leo,
there we
quadruple
go.
Leo. Fire signs.
We got that fire, right? And like I remember when I was in my 20s and first coming into a deeper feminist consciousness, just that anger that would boil, you know. And it's not that I don't ever get angry at sexism or racism or things, but it definitely has shifted. But there was that very raw energy there. And in your book, you talk quite a bit about anger. And one of the things that you say is anger will always have a purpose in fighting injustice, but you also say you became exhausted from rage. So I
Well,
was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more.
I tend to distinguish between anger and outrage.
Mm,
I generally was angry at people, and I really would turn that anger into hatred of those people.
mm,
But outrage is something that I feel good at expressing against injustice.
mm,
And so anger is my fuel, was eating me up inside, and it wasn't actually addressing the external challenges that I was facing. And one of my bosses, Reverend C.T. Vivian, who'd been an aide to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., used to tell us all the time when I was monitoring hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan that when you ask people to give up hate, then you have to be there for them when they do.
mm,
And I didn't like that when Reverend Vivian said it. I
mhm.
wanted to curse, but he was a preacher, so I couldn't say what I really felt about that sentiment because I'm a Black woman. If the Klan hates me, I'm all right hating them back. I mean, no skin off my teeth. But he was right when I saw that my anger was not achieving what I wanted it to do and that it was incinerating me from inside because I couldn't find inner peace. I had the resolve. It was fuel for my activism, but I was burning myself up. And
Mm,
so when I learned that I needed to transmute that anger into love, into
mm,
radical love, use my radical politics, but handle them responsibly with radical love,
mm,
then I found a clearer purpose for my activism. I
mhm,
achieved an inner peace that I didn't think was possible. When I was a human rights activist, I'm constantly looking at the worst things people do to each other. But I
mhm,
found that even that didn't have to steal my joy, didn't have to
mhm,
make me less resilient, didn't have to
mhm,
make me become something that I didn't want to become. Let me tell you a little story. I was doing a calling in training for the conflict resolution and negotiation unit at Harvard University. And I think it's 12 or 13 attorneys, one Black woman. And she was saying that she heard my presentation about calling in, and to her, it sounded very close to respectability politics. And she
mm,
said, "Oh, Loretta, you're telling me to give a pass to all these white people who keep committing these microaggressions against me? Like after 13 years, they're still asking, do I belong here? Am I
mhm,
qualified?" And when that happens to me, she said, I become the angry Black woman, a stereotype I don't want to lean into, but
mhm,
how can you not? Because these microaggressions feel like endless paper cuts that you
mm,
just can't heal. And so, what am I supposed to do with that? She asked. And so, instead of answering her question, I asked her another one. I said, "Oh, who are you inside?" And she thought a moment. She said, "Well, inside, I'm filled with love."
mm,
So I asked her, "Well, why aren't you pursuing accountability with love instead of anger?" Because maybe part of your anguish is that you're not being authentic to your true self,
mm,
that white supremacy and these microaggressions are forcing you into a role that you don't want to play. And it's not authentically you.
mm,
And then we started to teach her techniques for calling people in with love instead of anger and hatred.
mhm,
And I hope, I haven't checked in with her, but I hope that that has been a better, more authentic strategy for her that brings her more peace. The other thing about microaggressions and when people get on your nerves, because like I said, there's a lot of people I want to cancel, you also have to separate their stuff from your stuff.
mm,
Just because somebody comes at you from their own trauma, from their own inability to reconcile with trying to be positive and all of that. That doesn't mean you have to accept that invitation into a fight. You can just separate, use boundaries, and say, I'm so sorry that you're having a day that would make you come at me like that. I want you to have a better day. I respect you, and I hope that you do better. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can say once you learn calling in techniques so that you don't absorb someone else's projection of their discomfort or their rage or their insecurities onto you.
And that's again what I really appreciate is the practicality of what you're sharing. And this is not just a pie in the sky, kumbaya sort of philosophy or text. It's very practical. And that reframing you did of that respectability politics, right, which is this idea that we have to sort of put on a false self just to be accepted by the mainstream or the dominant group, but saying, no, that's actually more your authentic self, right, and lead from that. And so that's just such a beautiful reframe. And the other thing that I was really struck by as I read your book is particularly as someone at CIIS, which has a very big psychology, focus, is that your book is political, but it's not just political. It also delves into the psychology behind call outs. And, I hear you using words like ego and projection and trauma and all of these sort of like psychological terms, right? So, which I think is really useful, right? So I was wondering if you could unpack some of the psychology of call outs. Like, how do you see them functioning, particularly in terms of power and interpersonal dynamics?
Yeah. Well, first of all, to respond to a call out culture, I did an analysis of 5 options that you have when you're trying to deal with accountability. And so I'm going to discuss those first. Then I'm going to talk about where I tiptoed into the psychological realm. I think we're all familiar with call outs because that's publicly shaming somebody for something you think they've done wrong or said wrong that you think they need to be held accountable for. But the most important word in that sentence is that you did it publicly because you wanted others to see you holding somebody else accountable. And we call that virtue signaling. Now, when you want to go beyond the call out, you go into canceling somebody. That's when you want to get them really, really good because you think what they've done is so egregious that they need to be punished by either losing their job or their reputation or at least their platform. And that's what summons our inner Karen when we want to talk to the manager and get them fired. But there's a problem with the cancellation impulse as a human rights activist because it mimics the prison industrial complex. I mean, what does the carceral state do? It silences people, it exiles them, and it disposes of them like a used tissue because nobody ever wants to hear what has happened to people who are incarcerated. They only want to hear what they've done and punish them for it. And so I think that an alternative to calling out or canceling is calling in. Also, an accountability process, but instead of using anger, blaming, and shaming, you're choosing to use love and respect. So instead of reacting with anger to someone saying something that you think is problematic, you might say, that's an interesting perspective. Do you have time for you to tell me more about how you arrived at that? Because I used to use that word and I don't use it anymore. Can I share with you what I've learned about not using that word? There's all kinds of invitations to conversations we can make using calling in technique. You're still pointing out what was wrong. You're not just giving a pass to it, but you're choosing to call the person in, engage them in conversation instead of disposability. Now, a friend of mine, Sonia Renee Taylor, created the concept of calling on because there was this article about calling in the New York Times, and Sonia put out a video and said, "Wait a moment, Loretta. Sometimes you don't want to invest your time and attention into someone else's growth. Sometimes you just want to say, talk to the hand." So what you're supposed to do then? And so she invented the concept of calling on. And that's when you expect people to do better. You want them to reconcile their inner good opinion of themselves with their outer behavior or words. Don't have this cognitive dissonance going on where you think you're better than your actions portray. And I would say we're probably in one of those moments now with Trump voters and stuff like that. They think they're good people, but they did something wrong. And I love the way that young people use calling on, even though they don't know that's what they're doing. Because a young person, when they hear something that doesn't land well with on them, they look you dead in the eye and they say, "Are you okay?" And they're not asking about your health. They're basically saying, "You're not okay. You need to back up, check yourself, and get out of my face." They're saying all of that with 3 words, right? But they're calling on you to be better, but they're not going to give you their time and attention. And then the 5th C of my 5C continuum is calling it off. We have no obligation to engage in unproductive conversations with people. When people are lying, are trolling us, are gaslighting us, just wasting our time. And whether this is in person or online, we can choose to call it off. Now, having set up a taxonomy that analyzes what a range of options we have, the things that's required to use those options are what I call the 4 intelligences. And this gets to the psychological part. I think we're mostly familiar with the concept of emotional intelligence, self regulation, so that your trauma is not the lead, that you have a chance to actually develop the ability to maybe swallow the first thing that comes to your mind. And by the way, we self regulate all the time. Think about it. I find that as a parent and as a grandparent, and even I'm a great grandmother, I learned when I was parenting my son that I couldn't give voice to the first thing that popped into my head when he said something stupid or problematic. And if I had, he'd been in therapy for life. So we self-regulate. We know to swallow that first thought and then think about what we need to say to our child because we don't want to harm them. We self-regulate when our boss says something stupid. We don't out the first thing that we want to say to our boss because we don't want to get fired, right? And
Right.
so that's emotional intelligence when you know that you need to self regulate. But the other intelligences that I think we need to use to build this calling in culture shift I want, if the second one is cultural intelligence, which we used to call cultural competence or cultural ability. Understand that every human being has a different lived experience that tells them and informs their worldviews and their opinions. And so sometimes that's dictated by what culture they're embedded in, what they experience being part of that culture, their identity, whether they're queer, whether they're straight, whether they're Black, whether they're Asian, Native American, Latina, whatever. And so we have to develop cultural intelligence. The 2 other intelligences that I think are vital to calling in, the first one is called relational intelligence. And Adrienne Marie Brown writes a lot about being in right relationship, not only with other people, but with the Mother Earth and the universe, all of this, so that we don't do things that set us in bad relationship with each other. And so relational intelligence, so that you intentionally create the relationships that are sustainable for you. And for me, that's the relationship. The relationship that most matters starts with yourself. And that brings us to the 4th intelligence, and that's integrity intelligence, where you're constantly practicing making decisions that you can be proud of, that show off how you have honesty and compassion and caring for other people. And that is something that people don't think about. But when people don't do the right thing, they're self inflicting moral injuries to themselves. It's almost like cutting when somebody is in some kind of mental distress. But we should avoid those moral injuries, avoid taking advantage of the cashier who gave you too much change. You should give that back. Avoid going off at the person at the DMV when you're trying to get your driver's license just because she's had a bad day. Don't give
Right.
that back to her, because you
Yeah.
should be proud of how you react under these difficult situations. And so to create this calling in culture, you need emotional, cultural, relational, and integrity intelligence. And I'll close by saying an example of integrity intelligence is not only caring about the people you know and the people who know you. This is a combination of relational and integrity. Because as a human being with compassion, believing in human rights, you should care about bombs being dropped in Yemen if you never meet a Yemeni in your life,
Absolutely.
whether
Thank you.
they know
Yeah.
you or not. Your integrity demands that you have that global compassion for
Mm-hmm.
humanity and not that very European individualistic caring for only the people who know you or who you
Mm.
know.
Mm. Thank you. Mic drop right there. Thank you. I want to come back to this piece about cultural and relational intelligence because one of the things that I've noticed, and I will call myself out here because I've been just as guilty of this as anybody, is, those of us who've had the privilege of getting college degrees and taking classes in women's studies and gender studies and ethnic studies, we've developed certain ways of speaking, and you talk about it in the book sometimes as elitist or half Martian language. And we forget, right, that not everyone has gone through that. And then there can be this sort of like lack of cultural awareness of different generations, different, classes, different educational statuses, different, language barriers to understanding kind of the latest social justice jargon. And I see that as a real sort of weakness of sometimes of the progressive politics is this calling out of people for not using the right terms they may not have ever heard of that. Like you said, it could sound Martian to them. Like, what is that word?
Well, for me, I never thought not graduating college till I was 55 to be an advantage
Mm.
until I entered the language of postmodernism.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, these people deconstruct everything. And when I was working on my PhD at Emory University, which I dropped out, which is why I don't have one,
Mm-hmm.
I told one of my professors, after we deconstruct women, how am I supposed to organize them? Because I can't reconcile a 40-year feminist career with, well, we're not even sure who is a woman. I'm like, what are we talking about here?
Right.
And so I've never wanted to use a register that my grandmother couldn't understand. And actually, that's a quote from Bell Hooks, because I
Mm-hmm.
asked her when she wrote Ain't I a Woman why it was so accessible. And she said, I wanted my first book to be one my grandmother could understand. And
Mm-hmm.
then right after that, she wrote Feminism from Margin to Center that I needed a dictionary to understand, just to prove that she had the chops to write in postmodernist speak. But when we use those words that we are taught in our institutions, it's hard to avoid sounding condescending.
Mm.
When we say, "Oh, that's heteropatriarchy," we're
Right.
intelligible to each other. But when I was working at the Rape Crisis Center, we would say, it's that little something extra that women have to put up with.
And they
That
got that, right?
that is the same concept, but explained in accessible ways. And so we cannot build the power in the human rights movement if we insist on using those kinds of words. Now, in my book, did you encounter the spheres of influence concept that I presented?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What I recognize is that those of us who are in the human rights movement, because we're intensely political, we tend to have a lexicon, a language, a register that is unique to us because when we say neoliberal capitalism, we know what we're talking about.
Right.
When we say racism or anti-Semitism, we know what we're talking about. And I call us 90%ers because we share such a high level of unity or worldview with each other. It's not that we're 90% of the population, though I wish we were, but that high level of unity. Now, part of the chaos that's happening in the social justice world is that we're busy trying to turn 90%ers into 100%ers under the mistaken belief that if we're not 100% perfectly aligned, that we will not be able to work together. And so we put a lot of pressure on each other to think alike, use the same words, try to keep up with the latest thing TikTok says we should say. I mean, I was homeless and did anti-gentrification work for decades and then got chided one time because I said homeless instead of unhoused. And I'm like,
Right.
really?
Right.
Really?
And that language it changes all the time, right?
Who can keep up? Who
Right.
would want to keep up? So outside of that 90% bubble that we're too busy trying to turn into 100%ers are what I call the 75%ers. These are people who share enough worldview with me that I'm intelligible to them as long as I don't use that 90% language. So the 75%er for me as a feminist who believes in reproductive justice might be the Girl Scouts. They believe in girls and women's empowerment. We're going to share that goal, but they're probably going to be less political than me. Their main political activity may be voting and working in social services or community kitchens or something like that.
Sure.
But they're not going to attend all the rallies and the marches and the strategic planning sessions that we who are 90% are going to do. And so our job is not to talk down to them, because when you talk down to people, you make them feel stupid. And people don't need any help feeling bad about themselves.
Yeah.
They do pretty well on that on their own. And so
Right.
that's why how you say it has to be kind and not condescending. And outside of the 75%ers or the 50%ers, these are the people who I call 50%ers because they could go left or right, depending on who last influenced them. And so my parents were 50%ers. My father was a immigrant, military veteran, 26 years in the Army, hyper patriotic, member of the National Rifle Association. And so he was very conservative for a black, Jamaican immigrant. Basically, mom, Southern evangelical Christian who believed in faith healers and going to church every Sunday. Actually, she could go to church 2 or 3 times a week. When I talked to my parents, I had to always go underneath their top level words and speak to their values. So as a human rights activist, I would have say, Mom, you feed the hungry at your church. And as a human rights activist, I just ask why they're hungry in the first place. I'm living out your values, Mom, in a different way.
What a
Or
great way
dad,
of explaining it. That's fabulous. I love that.
or to dad, I can talk to him about patriotism means Uncle Sam doesn't renege on the deal around your health care. I'm not going to talk to him about deconstruction of neoliberal capitalism and privatization of social services.
And heteropatriarchy and
Right. But I
right.
am talking about someone breaking a promise that they made to you. And so I'm just saying, in that kind of analysis of who we can have the most influence with and how we can seek to build trust with them, because people only accept information from people that they trust. And when we talk down to people or assume that they have to use the words or think just like us, we're proving that we're not trustworthy.
And we're also doing what we are purportedly against, which is creating hierarchies based on privilege, right?
Educational privilege, right?
Yeah.
Social location privilege, all of those things we're weaponizing against others. Now, I find it quite interesting that the young students that I teach in gender and women's studies always can quote Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and June Jordan and Toni Cade Bambara, Barbara Smith to me. And every time they quote it to me and they're indulging in the call out culture, I remind them, quoting Bell is not good enough. You got to believe her. Bell wrote copious texts on how you match radical politics with radical love. So you just can't take the radical politics and leave the love aside.
Right, absolutely. And one of the most radical ways I read you enacting that is to actually working with someone we might consider a 0%er, a white supremacist, Klansman, or former Klansman, to be fair. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that experience, and also what would you say to someone who is like, Loretta, okay, I'm with you with the 90%, with the 75%, with the 50%. Why are you spending precious time and emotional labor on a white supremacist, even if they say they want to leave it? Like, why is that your job to help them?
I would argue that it's strategic. It ain't because I go around loving Nazis and Klansmen. I got better things to do with my time, right? But at the same time, most people are driven into hate movements because they're actually in pain. People are living great lives, generally speaking. I'm talking about the people being manipulated, not the ones doing the manipulating.
Right.
Because I have a call out strategy for the manipulators, the puppet masters. But
Okay.
for the people who are being manipulated through their, unannounced or unbelief, they don't even believe that they're racist as they are, or sexist as they are, or transphobic. They don't want to believe that about themselves. So I really want to emphasize the good side that they have because they're already getting enough criticism on the bad stuff. And so I think it's strategic to say, I'm coming from a different political position than you are, but I also want to appreciate your humanity. I want to take your pain seriously, and I want to offer you an opportunity to work together with other people who can help you give real solutions to your pain than the false solutions offered by those who want to take advantage of you and manipulate you. But for me, the reason it's strategic is that there is no reason for us to indulge in FAFO right now. And that's what the young people are called the F around and found out kind of info. You F around and you find out, right? What happened? That doesn't work for us, even though it may feel like a good I told you so. The reality is that the forces of fascism are harming people so much. There is no reason for us to leave those people who are being actively harmed and who got that alarm clock wake up call a little late out there to strengthen our opponents. We need to peel off that South underbelly of people who don't want to be seen as racist, who don't want to be seen as hateful and stuff, who don't want to be cruel, and pull them into the human rights movement as long as we don't get judgmental about how late they were in coming, the words that they don't know, the fact that they still may say something, I don't want to be woke. I mean, they are going to say a lot of things that we don't agree with as 90%ers. But they strengthen our power base in order to really affect and disempower the fascists. And so that's why I work with deprogramming white supremacists and our MAGA people, simply because I want to. Maurice Mitchell talks about the block and build strategy that we need to do. And I believe that, first of all, we got to block the growth of the fascist movement, which is very important, and build the strength of the human rights movement at the same time. And we do that by stopping the cannibalistic practices of those in the 90% tile and, pay attention seriously to the 75s and the 50s and pull in what I call the 25s into, because the way it's going to work is that the 90s are going to affect the 75s, the 75s are going to affect the 50s, and the 50s are going to affect the 25s because they're intelligible to each other.
Right.
The 90 is not going to immediately affect the 25 because we don't use the same language. We don't even watch the same news sources. But my mom and dad would watch Fox News. They can speak that language to them conveying my values to them.
So
And
we're kind
so,
of like, yeah, we're spreading new ways of thinking and being and disseminating it through different kind of circles of influence. That's such a helpful way of thinking about it. And I want to underscore a phrase that you use, which is taking people's pain seriously. And as an educator, one of the things that I've seen kind of prevent students of different identities, some who have more privilege, say they're white students or versus students of color, or straight students versus queer students, from really understanding how oppression and privilege operates, is because I think everyone wants to feel that their pain is real. And they'll be like, well, how can you say I have privilege when I'm suffering and I'm struggling, right? And we can just say, well, but look at the statistics and look at the facts and all of that. But I feel like we have to say, yes, your pain is real, and not but.
well, that's one of the reasons that with this attack on DEI, I actually do believe that the DEI brand has become so toxic that we need to wonder why if the best strategy is to be in constant defense of it, kind of like the term affirmative action has played out. Even though
Wow,
we
okay.
believe in its values, that doesn't mean we have to continue to use a brand that has played out. And so that's one of the reasons I'm suggesting that people pivot to the human rights framework, because it's an all-inclusive framework. Everybody has the same human rights, but also every human being has some mixture of advantages and disadvantages. Because even a rich person may have careless parents who didn't parent them well because the money
Yeah.
got in the way of establishing authentic relationships with your parents. I know as a poor kid, my parents didn't love me because of my money. And so there's all
Right.
kinds of different mixtures of advantages and disadvantages we have. And we can stop stereotyping people because they have certain identities and stuff. And we can see people for the individual human beings that they are. And so when you use the human rights framework, you use the concept of intersectionality to explore which vulnerabilities need to be attended to so that people without those vulnerabilities have, have the same human rights. I mean, have people with those vulnerabilities have the same human rights as those without. So the way I explain it most accessibly is that every child has a human right to an education, but a blind child might need her books in Braille. You pay attention to her special vulnerabilities so that she can enjoy the same human rights as sighted children. And so it may be a white child in rural California who doesn't have internet access, or the way they're shutting down hospitals in rural America. It may be that white woman who has to drive 2 hours to get to deliver a baby. When you
Right.
use the human rights framework, you're paying attention to everybody's pain, and it matters. And I think that not only does it promote an inclusive framework that still contains our values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it widens the perception, the optics of who's included in that. And even at the same time, it puts the opponents to human rights on the defensive. Because instead of saying they're against critical race theory or they're against Black privilege or whatever they want to talk about, tell me why you're opposed to human rights.
Right, right. That's brilliant. I think that's brilliant, because I think that there's a contingent of people who are truly against, true equality. But I think for most people, what they're reacting to is this feeling of constantly feeling like their language is being policed and feeling like they're being talked down to or made to feel like they're bad for just being who they are, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I really appreciate that reframing.
I
Yeah.
think it's going to work beautifully for us because it not only brings us together, but it also cautions us not to create contradictions in our own movement. So I
Mm-hmm.
can't do work against anti-Black racism in a homophobic way without
Mm.
violating human rights. I
Mm-hmm.
can't do work against transphobia in a misogynistic way without
Mm-hmm.
violating human rights. I can't
Right.
do work, for immigrants in a way that is racist without
Without,
violating human rights, and
yeah.
on and on. And so it compels us to do the work that creates the vision of the world we want to create, so that we're
Mm-hmm.
not just replicating, like Paulo Freire cautions out us
Right.
against, at the oppressors becoming the oppressed becoming the
Sure.
oppressor.
Yeah.
That we
Yeah.
actually do model the world that we want by how
Mm-hmm.
we treat the people that we'd rather cancel.
Mm. So you're creating a bigger umbrella. Yeah.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
an umbrella of joy, abundance, and love,
Mm.
not an umbrella of, I'm going to organize people so that I can tell them that you can safely hate those people.
Right. Right. And they're out, you know. Yeah, they're not pure. Right.
Exactly.
You know, Loretta, if I may, I want to pivot just a little bit, and I want to talk about the concept of spirituality. And that may be, that's I teach in a program on women's spirituality. It's something very dear to my heart. And I felt, and let me know if I'm projecting, that even though you didn't use the word spirituality in your book, I read this as a deeply spiritual text. I
Thank
mean, when
you.
I hear about radical love and hope and joy, um, I just want to know, is that accurate? And what role has faith or spirituality played in your journey?
Well, I was raised a Christian, as my
Mhm.
mother would have insisted on,
Mhm.
but she was very ecumenical. She didn't care which church you went to as long as you went to church. So I had a chance to sample a lot of different churches based on who my friends were. And they took me to, so I went through a Catholic church or Baptist church or an AME church. I think my final church was I know my final church was Church of Christ. So I don't see myself as a religious person in
Mhm.
particular, and only others describe me as spiritual because I'm very much a scientist. I majored in
Mm.
chemistry and physics, and so
Mm.
I tend to see things in very linear ways.
Got it.
And so people describe me as spiritual, but I would not describe myself that way. I
Yeah.
use logic because
Right.
I believe that we deserve a better world.
Mhm.
I do believe in karma if there's that spirituality, because
That's a spiritual concept.
right. Well, I do believe in karma, and karma's a bitch, but she got real good aim. So I kind of put out there what I want to
Yeah.
receive. And I've
Yeah.
lived that all my life because whenever I've done good in the world, it
Mhm.
comes back multiplied. But
Mm.
I'm telling you, the opposite is true too. I have to be careful not to tell a lie because then that'll come back. If I lie
Mhm.
about being sick and going to work, guess what? I get sick the next week. I mean, I just
You
can't.
manifest the sickness, right?
Yeah, I manifest stuff that I want and don't want.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't consider myself a spiritual being
Okay.
at all, but I'm not people call me humanist, but I don't think I'm a humanist because I kind of like a live and let live philosophy.
Mhm.
Choose whatever brings you comfort in this
Mhm.
very chaotic, dangerous
Mhm.
world. And
Right.
whatever brings you inner peace, I'm with that for you. And I
Right.
choose my inner peace by how I treat other human beings, and I treat other human beings based on how my integrity compels it. Because I
Mm.
always want to be the best Loretta I can be.
Mm. Mhm. I'm so glad that you actually named that, that you don't identify as spiritual, but you don't get, rather than taking offense that someone would put that label on you, you're like, thank you. And it's a way of being like, hey, we can be different in that way, right? We all have our different paradigms that we come in, our different belief systems, and we can still work together, right? We don't have to create exclusions on who does identify that way or doesn't.
Like I said, I think my mom's ecumenical upbringing created in me a tolerance from
Mm-hmm.
childhood that she didn't insist on one particular belief system, but she
Mm-hmm.
did insist that you have some relationship with a higher power.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it worked for me until it didn't work for me. But at the same time, it taught me a tolerance and an embracing of everybody's spiritual tradition. So I can just as easily go to a church as I can go to a synagogue, or as I can go to some pagan ceremony. For me, I love the fact that people get their comfort in their own ways. And the spiritual quote that I find resonates most with me is actually a Jewish quote, even though I know very little about Judaism. But one of my mentors was an Israeli American. She's passed now. But she taught me this quote. She says, the Talmud says that my neighbor's material needs are my spiritual needs.
Ooh.
I cannot be right with God if I'm not right with my neighbors and my community. God will not accept me if I ignore the needs of my neighbors and community. I thought that was the most beautifully expressed feeling of
Yeah.
interdependence and interconnectedness I've ever heard any organized religion offer.
I have not heard that one before. Thank you. Thank you. I think that's really profound. And you know, the other thing that I wanted to kind of circle back to is earlier, and you talk about this in your book, talking to students who say, you know, I'm so afraid of saying the wrong thing, right? Whether it's about religion or race or, you know, sexuality, that I walk around on eggshells. Now, you've given great strategies that if we've been harmed, or if we hear someone say something offensive, how do we call people in? But what do we do for, and you know, I'll say as a professor or just as a human being, I've had those fears too, right? Of being called out, of being canceled. I haven't had a young person look me in the eye yet and ask me if I'm okay, but I'm sure it will happen. Um, what strategies can those of us who have that fear, what can we use to walk in the world without being afraid all the time of being canceled?
Oh, I like teaching in numbers, like 1, 2, 3 systems. So if you've been called out, it's a 1, 2, 3 process. Actually, the first thing you do is thank the person. And that sounds counterintuitive, but that person just gifted you with something that social media companies are paying billions to get. They gifted you with time and attention. So you can sincerely say, thank you for noticing me. Thank you for appreciating that I'm significant, that I matter. Because if you thought I didn't matter, you wouldn't have even bothered to call me out. Right? So you don't have to say all of that, but have
Right.
that in your head as you say, thank you. Step one. Step two is that when people call you out, the thing they want most is to be heard. They don't want you to brush them off, deny that you've done harm or anything like that. And so you can assure them, thank you for calling me out. I'm going to consider seriously what you just said. You have assured them that they've been heard. But what you have not done is agree with them. Right? So you can assure people of their significance and that they've been heard and that you're going to think about this in your own good time. Right? So it doesn't cost you anything to say thank you and I've heard you. And then the third step is to turn the calling out into a calling in. And you can say, thank you. I'm going to consider what you said, but I want to ask about you because I care much about you as I do myself. Are you okay? Because you chose to get my attention this way when I'm pretty sure you could have DM'd me, you could have done a whole lot of things. So I want to know what's going on with you. Do you mind if we have a conversation to talk about what's going on with you? And I can tell you what's going on with me. And then we can figure out how to work this out. 1, 2, 3, thank them, tell them you heard them, call them in. You can handle
Beautiful.
almost every call out that way.
Beautiful. And so if we know we have those sort of tools in our toolbox, maybe we don't have to be as afraid to say what we think.
Right. The other thing I talk about in my book is how to make an apology right away when someone has accused you of doing harm, and how to make an apology the right way after you've had chance to think about what they've said. And then you can make
Right.
a plan if you've caused harm. to make amends, to apologize, to make a plan for not doing it again. And so, again, the book is full of techniques for different scenarios and situations you may find yourself in when you're encountering the call out culture, when you feel compelled to call somebody else out, when
Right.
you see somebody else getting mobbed and you want to know whether you should intervene or not. Can you intervene? All those kinds of things.
I hear what you're saying, right? But in my experience, there may be times where you feel like, yeah, you know what, I did say the wrong thing, right? And I'm willing to apologize. But what about if it's an incident where you're like, I'm pretty sure they're projecting here because I didn't, or we just disagree, I'm not, why would I apologize if I just have a disagreement with this person? That's
But
not.
you may still disagree on substance, but it may be how you disagreed still made them feel some kind of way. So that's the right of way apology moment.
Right. That's the seeing them and seeing their pain.
Right.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you don't want to go around causing harm, even if you disagree.
Right.
So
Right.
you can say, well, I'm so sorry. What I said made you feel that way.
Mm.
But still, can we talk more
Mm.
so that we can arrive at some kind of mutual understanding of each other, if not agreement?
Keeping that conversation open.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very few people resist the invitation to tell you more about their life.
Yeah. Yeah. People like to talk about themselves.
Yeah.
It's very true. So, Loretta, I imagine there's lots of folks who are listening to this or who have read your book who are like, you know what? This is what I've been hungry for. How do I learn more? How do I get more involved in this movement of human rights and calling in? What can some next steps be that people can take?
Well, I teach these courses online.
Hmm.
And so you can go to my website, lorettajross.com. And I have an ongoing course going on right now. It's on Tuesday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Each lecture is only $5. The
Ah,
whole series is $20.
that's amazing.
So I call myself the Walmart of consciousness raising. And if you paid the $20 for the lecture series, then you can access all the videotapes for the ones you missed.
That's
And,
amazing.
and so we keep these on a rolling basis. I have a staff, a team that, and actually one of my teams on Yahoo is from Oakland. But anyway, we make this accessible to as wide an audience as possible because we have to create this culture shift. I want a lot of different people thinking many different thoughts about social justice to learn how to move in the same direction. I don't want a lot of different people thinking one thought about social justice and moving in the same direction because that's a cult. It's not a human rights movement. And so anybody wanting more can go to lorettajross.com and join our classes. We get hundreds of people every lesson and people often take it repetitively. They take each session. I mean, you can afford $20, right? And so
Right. Well,
very
I thank you. And that's great, right? Like that's so accessible to students, working people, that's really amazing. And the thing you said about a cult, and we have to pivot to Q&A now, but that just really struck me. I know you write about that in your book too, right? Like what it means to be a coalition, which means people who think differently but are working toward a shared goal versus a cult. So yeah.
we have an example of that in the women's movement.
Hmm.
Everybody in the women's movement opposes the patriarchy. But
Hmm.
we work on it in different organizations, in different ways, in different disciplines, and in different settings. That's
Right.
why we're a women's movement and not
Right,
a women's
exactly.
cult.
Right, right, because that would be quite dangerous, right? And it seems like there's some, activists out there who kind of almost want it to be like a cult, where you have to have the exact same language and the exact same analysis. But but again, what I really hear you saying about movement building is building that wider umbrella.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you need the security of certainty, you may want to examine how much you've ingested white supremacist thinking. Because
Mm.
people who are dealing with oppression are what Gloria Anzaldúa called borderlands people. We
Mm.
live and delight in the land of ambiguity. We are not searching for certitude, black and whites and binaries. We
Right.
like the fact that we have all of these continuums and all of these ways, multifaceted ways of being, looking, experiencing. Well, that's our joy. And so be borderlands people instead of absolutists.
I love that. Wonderful. I'm going to give you a moment to catch your breath, and it looks like we have some questions that have come in. This is a really great question here. It's someone wrote, I appreciate your practical and strategic approach to talking with people who are not 100%ers. But how can we alchemize our disappointment and anger so we can work with the less than 90%ers? What has worked for you, and what can we do to avoid burnout?
Well, when I was a young activist starting at 16 years old, I thought I knew everything. And thank God my older Black women in my life who were mentoring me didn't give up on insufferable me. Because I thought I knew everything and I was working hard and didn't give myself any time to rest. And I was in school at the time. And I mean, I was 24/7. And strangely enough, one of those older women said, Loretta, you need to pace yourself. And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, you need to learn how to party as hard as you work. Well, I wasn't going to tell a teenager to party, but I
Wow.
didn't know that partying had a purpose of sustainability. So the way that that works for me is that I have a consciousness toggle switch that I can toggle on when I want to do a deep critique of something, and I can toggle it off when I want to watch the Black Panther or Barbie movie, so that I can just enjoy the humanity of
Right.
having fun and escapism and all of that without feeling guilty about it. So that was one sustainability strategy that was taught me as a teenager. My second one came to me in a more serious context. When I monitored hate groups in the 1990s, I had to go to Blakely, Georgia. And in Blakely, a 5-year-old child had died in a house fire when the fire department was only 2 blocks from their house, and they took an hour to get there because the fire department was being run by the Ku Klux Klan. And that's why the Black citizens of Blakely had bought us in, because too many Black homes were burning down, and the Klansmen were calling it neighborhood beautification. And so this child had died, and I was so angry because we felt so impotent, so powerless to do anything. And my friend, my mentor, Leonard Zeskin, who was with me on this trip to Blakely, he said, Loretta, you need to lighten up. And I looked at him like he lost his mind. How can I lighten up, Leonard? You know, you just know what we just saw. He said, Loretta, fighting Nazis should be fun. It is being a Nazi that sucks. And he immediately made me laugh, but he also immediately gave me perspective. If you are not finding your joy and your sustainability and your resilience in doing human rights work, maybe you're doing the work wrong. Because you're on the right side of history. You're on the right side of love. You're on the right side of humanity.
Yeah.
That's not the place to be miserable.
Right.
Let the other
Right.
people be miserable. And so having mentors who took me seriously and forgave me for my mistakes and my arrogance and my ego, who still offered me this kind of timeless, wise advice, is what has sustained me for over 50 years doing this work. And I haven't even felt like burnout.
Wow.
Because I'm always making sure for time for intentional joy. I have intentional friends who can call me out when I'm messing up, call me in when they need to. But I also remember to have a whole set of apolitical friends who are in the 25 to 0% range, who keep me balanced and centered.
Thank you. I mean, and it's like if you can continue to find joy after hearing about a 5-year-old being killed, it's like those who are upset about someone using the wrong, you know, social justice
Pronoun,
term or whatever. It's like, yeah.
right.
Yeah, so really thank you for offering that sort of wider perspective, and thank you for that question, Anjali. Okay, we have a rather different question now from Rachel, which is calling in something you can do on social media, or does it work better in person?
Social media is filled with people what we call having parasocial relationships with each other. It's almost
Hmm.
like the feeling of a relationship that's not actually real, that you
Mm-hmm.
don't actually have with people in many times. Because
Mm-hmm.
there's so many people faking it on social media, so you never quite know what you're actually dealing with. And so that's where you're going to have to calibrate your conflict and decide if that is a wise investment of your time. I do caution my young people that I teach around doom scrolling. Don't just get sunk into, I mean, the course I teach is called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump. We're looking at fascism all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm teaching. But the thing to do is not to get sunk into the depths of where the fascists want you to be dispirited, fearful,
Mm-hmm.
all those things. And social media can suck you down so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's your disengagement opportunity to call it off. Unless you have an actual relationship with the person on social media, you really need to always evaluate if that's a productive use of your time. Trying to call in strangers that may not even be who they say they are, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
Trying to capture smoke in your hands. Why would you? And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's our egos that convince us that we can flip or change strangers. And I'm like, most people don't even have the magic words to change the people that they sleep with every night. Some
Right.
unknown, catfishing stranger on the
Yeah.
internet.
Right. Yeah, thank you. It's like it becomes a sort of game almost, and it loses that relational intelligence piece that you talked about earlier. Yeah, thank you. So we have a question here from Ratna, which is, I'm curious if you could share your strategies for the 0%, the manipulators, the puppet masters.
I do anti fascist work. I was taught it by the people in the civil rights movement in the 1990s. So, my
Mm,
strategies for them are opposition research. I monitor them, I
mm,
expose them, I analyze what they're saying, I do research on who they're hanging out with, I trace their
mhm,
ideas from one source to another. So, if I see an idea or a strategy appearing in a white supremacist thing, and then it shows up in an anti-abortion thing, then it shows up in an anti-gay or anti-trans thing. I
mm,
expose them, uh, uh, and so, and occasionally I'll try to talk to them. Now, what I don't do anymore is go on right-wing talk shows or anything like that. I
mm,
used to do a lot of that in the 90s, go on Fox News and all the right-wing talk
mm,
shows and stuff. I don't do that anymore because what I've also learned is that no matter what I say, they're going to lie about it anyway because they've got a
mm.
narrative that they're going to tell.
Right.
And so I have no need to feed them with my presence because they're going to lie anyway. I mean, Fox News did a whole story on me in December because of the name of my course. And
Hmm.
they didn't interview me. They just told a bunch of lies. So that's what
Hmm.
they do. But I can teach and many people can teach people how to do opposition research
Mhm.
against the zeros. And then we take that research and educate people. We want to inoculate people against being
Mhm.
susceptible to their lies and their violence and things like that. But I'm not trying to call them in, and
Right.
when necessary, I call them out, just like I called Fox News out for lying and that kind of thing,
Got
because
it.
they have no intention of playing fair, having any adherence to the truth, those kinds of things. But I
Right.
do, but you have to have a degree of expertise when you do it and a
Mhm.
degree of nuance even then, because if you're trying to get in the 25 percenters, one of the bad things you can do, or bad strategic things you can do, is criticize somebody who they trust. So when I'm talking to a 25%er, I'm not going to start off with a critique of Donald Trump.
Right.
Because that already says you must be stupid to be supporting him, or you're racist, or you're this. All of the things they've heard already. I don't want to reinforce that narrative and stuff. And so it's very hard if you start off criticizing somebody they trust to then earn their trust. And so you earn their trust by appreciating what you see good about them. Because I even wrote an article the other day and I said, I suspect most MAGAs are kind to their pets and their parents or their children, or they're passionate about their book bannings and all the other stuff. I actually believe many of them are sincere. They think they're saving America, you know?
Absolutely.
And so I'm going to honor that passion for saving America, even as I critique the strategies they're using to do it.
Thank you. What I hear in your answer is really about discernment. And our next question from an anonymous person is also about that discernment. And they ask, how can we decipher if trying to call someone in might cause additional harm to ourselves? How do we protect ourselves while being compassionate to others in these situations?
The first thing you'll learn in my book is that you have to do a self-assessment, whether you call people in or out. Because if you are still healing from your soul wounds, all you're going to do is bleed all over them anyway. So it ain't going to work, whether you're trying to call in or out. So your first priority is to take care of yourself, right? Make sure that you attend to your healing, that you don't do things causing more harm to yourself. But some of us are further along on our healing journey. So I wouldn't ask someone who has been recently raped to try to talk to a rapist, but my rape was 50 years ago. So I'm in a better healed place to talk to that rapist and try to use some transformative or restorative practices with them. And so only do what your bandwidth tells you you are capable of doing. There's no obligation to call people in, but I do suggest that you have no obligation to be cruel either, because your trauma doesn't justify your causing harm.
I want to really, underscore that, or the fact that we've been traumatized doesn't justify causing harm to others. Thank you. Thank you for naming that.
You don't have to hurt people to prove that you've been hurt.
Right. And and it seems so often that that's kind of what people are trying to get, is that validation, right? That they've been hurt and being seen in that. Yeah. This next one, I feel like you sort of answered it already, but I'll share it anyway. There may be another angle to it that you want to bring forth, which is, how do we find common ground with those that hold such different and often hurtful values to us?
Well, first of all, this may sound like it's impossible to do, but there are going to be common ground issues. Let me put it this way. I love the way people respond in the face of a natural disaster. When there's an earthquake or a fire or a hurricane or tornado, we don't stop to ask, what race are they? Do they have immigration papers? Oh, are they queer? We don't ask none of those questions. We only ask, do you need help and can we help? That is in most human beings. I'm not going to say all, because there are some people out there that will walk away and throw paper towels at a hurricane.
Right, like the KKK example you gave about the firefighters, but that's not most people.
But most people have that inner compassion, that inner humanity in them already. And so all I'm saying is that the calling in culture allows us to say, I see that good in you. I just want you to universalize it and use it for man-made disasters too, like poverty, like racism, like sexism, because I see you demonstrating it here. I know it's in you. So tell me, what is interfering with you offering that which is good about you more widely.
Yeah. You know, that reminds me of a text I just started perusing called A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit, where she talks about all
Rebecca's
these
an
examples.
amazing writer.
Yeah, all these examples of people coming together in natural disasters. And I love how you kind of connect that to man-made disasters.
Choking on water.
Ah, let's take a moment. Yeah.
Yeah. But when you're using calling in technique, you're choosing to emphasize compassion over cruelty because there's too much emphasis on cruelty already. And Adrienne Marie Brown, who's one of the most brilliant analysts I know, says what you pay attention to grows. So if you're only paying attention to the cruel side of people, that's what's going to flourish and grow. But if you pay attention to that innate kindness in them, whether they treat their pets right or, participate in growing a community garden or are passionate about what children are getting educated, there is room there.
There's
for
something
you
we
to
can
build
find.
on that and make them feel good about changing themselves, because you can't change anybody, but you can give them room to grow, to change themselves.
Thank you. I hope you're feeling okay.
I am. I'm just still choking on water.
Yeah.
I sucked it down too fast.
So another question we have here is, how do we use this calling in as a practice in everyday life and not just in moments of crisis?
Well, it's going to be like riding a bicycle. You're going to fall off a couple of times before you actually master the technique. What I find is that when you first encounter a situation that makes you uncomfortable and makes you want to maybe resort to calling somebody out, put yourself on pause. Swallow that first thought. Do that self-assessment so that you can see where you are. Am I hungry? Am I angry or hangry? Like people say, do I not have the bandwidth to deal with this? Take care of self first. And if you that check in with yourself, that okay, I've got the capacity right now to maybe go a step further, then you can choose from the 5 C's which one that's more appropriate for the situation. And I do want to say, call outs do have their purposes. So you don't take calling out and canceling off the out of the
table.
toolbox. It should be there for people who are abusing their power over others, causing harm, and have been given a chance to change and chose not to. I mean, this is what the human rights movement does. We call out corporations, governments, and individuals who abuse people's human rights. But what I want people to understand, that it's our tactic of last resort. We try a whole lot of other stuff before we get to the call out canceling step, because that means we're only committed to a fight with them at that point. We have no hopes of having a future relationship with that person when we choose to call them out that way. And so there are times you can use calling out to build community with people who are affected by the harm, to spread word that the harm is taking place, to lift the voices of those who have been historically ignored or silenced. So in my book, I do talk about the purposes and uses of call out.
And that's one of the things I appreciated. You're like, there's different tools for different situations.
Exactly. So it's not like never call anybody out, just sing kumbaya with the worst people in the world. It ain't about that at all. And again, it's about being strategic, so that I want to get the people. I mean, there's a difference, because intent matters as much as impact. I have a different strategy for the accidental racist versus the intentional one. It's just like if someone steps on my foot accidentally, I'm going to have a different response than if they did it on purpose.
Right. You know, and
That's just life, though.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because here at CIS we have these principles of community, and one is intent versus impact. And I feel that sometimes people take that to mean that, you know, it doesn't matter what your intention is as long as I perceived offense, you know, but what I hear you say, it's both. It's not just one or the other, right?
When your foot's going to still hurt,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's a matter of whether or not you're going to respond to it as if they meant to hurt you, or you're
Mm-hmm.
going to respond to it as with the normal harm we human beings do to each other all the time. And
Mm.
there is such a distressing level of racial and gender ignorance in our society that ain't
Mm-hmm.
people's fault. I mean, we
Mm-hmm.
have a whole society that not only can't tell a charlatan like Trump from a qualified black woman running for president,
Mm-hmm.
and then we had so many people, and I know I'm getting in trouble now, who thought that they could throw away their votes by either not voting or voting for a third party candidate because they felt that the immediate consequences of their vote wouldn't land on them,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And that's a certain amount of arrogance there, right? Because if you look at what happened in the last election, Trump only got 49% of the vote. 5% of the active voters chose to vote for third parties instead of Harris.
Mm-hmm.
So if
Mm-hmm.
Harris had gotten that 5%, Trump wouldn't be president right now. And that
Mm-hmm.
was the hard left who did that. I
Mm-hmm.
can't blame that on Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah,
know, those of us who'd rather be righteous than effective.
hmm. That's really amazing food for thought. Thank you. Thank you. You know, there's I feel like you've already answered this, but I want to share the question just to name the question because it was so beautifully phrased, which is, how do we prepare our hearts and communities for the tenderness of being called in, or the courage it takes to call someone in with care? And, you know, I feel you just spoke to that actually when you talked about the checking in with yourself and the kind of the somatic awareness.
Well, as I say, and I'll repeat over and over, the first person that you call in is yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And you make a conscious decision whether you're going to be trauma driven or trauma informed. And it requires a certain amount of humility, but it also requires the strong appreciation that vulnerability is strength, not
Mm.
weakness.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
the way you want people to be mature enough to admit they made a mistake and own it, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to dealing with their mistakes like they're children and try to hide them or deny them and stuff like that.
Yeah.
When you learn that vulnerability is strength, then you're really appreciating all that you can become.
Mm.
And I think adulting is learning to tell fewer lies to yourself.
Yeah.
You
Right,
know,
right,
that's maturity right there.
right.
When
And
you're
that comes
still
back.
lying to yourself, you're still acting like a child.
Yeah. And that comes back to the authenticity you were talking about and just how much authenticity there is in your story. So I really encourage folks to read the book and read through some of the stories that you share. I'm going to close with the final question, and then you can also add anything else you want to add. And I think this is such a great way to close out our conversation tonight, which is, where are you finding intentional moments of joy these days in these difficult times, as you've named?
I find it when people respond to my calling in classes and they say, you know, I had I have a mother-in-law where we have not gotten along for 15 years. And instead of accusing me of stuff and me accusing her of stuff, I just asked her, how hard was it to raise your kids?
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, we had the best conversation in the world with my
Mm-hmm.
Trumpist mother-in-law.
Hmm.
When people give me that kind of feedback and I see them putting it in their everyday practices with their personal relationships as well as their political ones, that brings me joy because all that I'm giving to this movement, and you know, it costs $250,000 for me to finance these online classes.
Wow.
So I'm what it feels like what I'm investing in building movement is giving me
Hmm.
that joy in return.
Thank you. And you certainly radiate that joy. Thank you again, Loretta. And I know you've stayed up quite, you've been up quite late with this out there on the East Coast. Thank you. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to the CIIS public program staff for putting this together. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.